Hi, everyone, and welcome to this breakfast seminar conversation, the role of Africa in Chinese foreign and development policy. I'm Jørgen Gåsemyr. I'm a researcher at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen, and I have a position at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. This breakfast forum is part of a seminar series that we have for a project that is organized by the Christian Michelsen CMI Institute in Bergen and the University of Bergen with my department. I myself specialize on Chinese politics. I'm very much not an expert on African affairs. And that's why I'm so happy to have with me two excellent colleagues who are based in Shanghai or close to Shanghai, Pippa Morgan and Zheng from Fudan University. Hi, are you there?
Hi, nice to see you, and nice to see everyone in the audience, whether virtual or in person.
I think it will probably be mostly virtual. We'll go into a conversation, and on the practicalities, we'll keep it very informal. So I will moderate the conversation and pitch in a bit myself on topics I feel it's worthwhile to also hear what I have to say. You will be able to ask questions, but since there might be quite a few online participants, we ask that you type those questions, and we'll be speaking for an hour about, and then we'll allow you to ask a few questions afterwards. Zheng has an important engagement towards the end of our seminar, so he will have to leave 15 minutes or so early. So Pippa and myself will be finalizing that conversation. So as I said, I am here in Bergen. Pippa, I assume, is in Shanghai or in Kunshan. She is a lecturer at the Duke Kunshan University, has had a period at the Shanghai affiliation of the New York University, and also came from the Fudan University. And that's where Zheng, of course, is a professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs. I think it's safe to say that we're dealing with a topic or a broader theme that a lot of people pay a lot of attention today, not least in this age of a lot of international crises with a big pandemic, and where development policies and development issues play a strong role. Today, we're not really here to discuss what's happening so much with Africa or to what extent China is affecting what's happening in Africa, but really how those experiences and lessons and the things that China have been doing in Africa is kind of feeding back and looping back to also shaping Chinese foreign and development policies. To look down on my script here, it's in line with the title. It's where I've said the role of Africa in Chinese foreign and development policy. That very much kind of catches my own take on things, that development policies and broader foreign policies are very much kind of intertwined and sometimes a bit hard to separate. What's your take? Is that something you agree with, and why, or do you see that differently? Anyone want to go for it? Maybe you want to jump in first?
Okay. Thank you, Hans. I think it's great to be back on this, Bergen Global again. I think I was here. I think it's last month or 2 months ago, right? So it's always good to come to talk about this, China Africa thing. So yeah, I think you said it's whether it's the China Africa is more about foreign policy or development policy. I think it's a very interesting question, which I think it's traditionally we actually see China and Africa relations is more from a foreign policy perspective. I think as we see that China has been having an official so like a rhetoric to look at it African as the partner from this the developing world. So I think that's has always been like that, since China has since the 1960s. But we also see in recent years there is a changing part of this relationship, as we see this economic relationship has become more important. Especially China has been put a lot of giving, in addition to the aid, which is China has been traditionally continuously give to provide to Africa, but we also investments and also the trade relations between China and Africa has increased dramatically in recent years. So I think I should say I think this both issues I think is we can actually look at from foreign policy perspective, but also more importantly now it's become a development policy area. Yeah.
All right, Pippa, do you want to chip in?
Sure. So thank you. It's a great question. So I would actually just second what you said in that, relations with Africa have been a kind of pillar of Chinese foreign policies and dating back to the 1960s. And, African countries played a very important role, for example, in China's taking of the United Nations seat in 1971. And China's foreign aid policy has been kind of intertwined with that and seen as, somewhat of a kind of thank you for the support, the votes of African countries in China joining the United Nations. But I totally agree with what you said about the economic relationship becoming, and this kind of very diversified economic relationship becoming more and more important over time. And I just add to that, in line with that, increasing kind of different kinds of economic connections, you also see this kind of decentralization. So whereas previously the relationship was very much kind of top-down diplomacy driven, now you still have that top-down diplomacy being super important, but at the same time, there's all these kind of, people to people and company to company level connections that are also, outside of this top-down diplomatic relationship, playing an incredibly important, role in shaping the way that China-Africa relations occur.
All right, great. I think you're already jumping into quite a few issues that we want to elaborate on further on, but I actually forgot my first question. We all come to this academic world with kind of different backgrounds and different perspectives. And I wanted to ask you, because this is supposed to be very much like an informal conversation based on our research. How did you guys come to study China-Africa issues or China-Africa relations and development-related themes? Back to you.
Yeah, I was actually, actually came to the African fields relatively late. I was initially interested in, I also have an interest in this economic development, but initially was actually more about the China's economic development. So how did China attract foreign investments to help its economic development? This is sort of like the issue, the top subject has been working on for years, and through my PhD and also my first book, but I always put China into a comparative perspective to compare China with some other latecomers like Indian, Vietnam. And I think that's sort of like what I'm having this kind of like a research interest to look at the political economy of this developing countries. Then I think it's in last few years I'm starting to look at it as the latecomers, which is I think it's the Africa, which their development experience has I want to ask a question, how different or how similar are those latecomers experience compared to this kind of latecomers like China's and like India's or Vietnam's. So I think this is actually bring me to this a study on this Africa, China-Africa relations. I think it's also as we see this Chinese economic engagements, Africa has increased, dramatically. So which I think is this just bring me to this field. I think look at both, from the China side of the story and also from the African side of the story. Yeah.
Good to know. That's your way in. It's a good way. How about you, Pippa?
Yeah, so my way into China-Africa relations is actually very closely connected to you, because he was my my dissertation advisor. But I almost kind of fell into it by accident. So I came into this topic basically from an interest in China, and an interest in Chinese foreign policy, and an interest in China's economic relations with the rest of the world. And I think you mentioned in your introduction that I did my PhD at Fudan. And as I was kind of looking for what can I do as my PhD topic? Where can I kind of add, something, make a contribution, add value? And I noticed that everyone was kind of talking about China-Africa relations, and it was becoming a hot topic, but no one was really saying all that much about China's. It was always being framed as this kind of new phenomenon. No one was really saying that much about the fact that China has actually, been engaged in in African development for, since the 1950s. And so I thought, okay, this is where I can, perhaps do something interesting. And then I found you, who was a wonderful, wonderful, expert in development, and that's really how I fell into the topic. And then I just kind of never stopped, after that, having realized what how much there is to explore. So I started out with an interest in the foreign aid, but then moved out into, for example, foreign direct investment and these more kind of commercial relations between China and Africa.
All right, and I've got to say, you both made and are still making great contributions. So I encourage everyone listening in here or watching also to go back and look at the publications of these guys. It's some good stuff. I think my own take or own way into this is a bit similar to, or in a bit between maybe your guys. I was studying in China, in Beijing in the early 2000s, when a lot of kind of the more recent dynamics around China-Africa relations really started taking off with the first China-Africa Cooperation Forum and a lot of visits. And I also started worked for a couple of years in the United Nations and an agency in Beijing. And of course, a lot of our attention during the time I was there started shifting from contributing or kind of strategizing to contribute to China's own development, then moving target to looking at what China might also be offering or doing together with African and other developing countries. And then after started studying my PhD and finishing that, I've been lucky enough to be surrounded by a lot of people really being Africa experts. And then my contribution was, of course, to try to provide kind of the lens from China. And then I think on this topic today, the more that I have looked into it and keep looking into it, I really also see China doing things and trying out things in various African countries in terms of kind of continuing the Chinese tradition of experimenting and trying out new things, and also some policies that they try to, or kind of dynamics that try to also create elsewhere, which is not necessarily working always, because of course African and certainly a few African countries have a lot of special characteristics when it comes to the China dimension. I think Pippa, you started already kind of digging into it, looking, my next question is on this kind of special bond. Could you elaborate a little bit? What is this special thing about China and Africa, or at least China and a few African countries, that kind of traces decades back in time and that people still care about as something special?
Yeah, so this really goes back to when the People's Republic of China, which was established in 1949, and many African countries were also first kind of decolonizing in the 1950s and 1960s. And certain African countries and also China were looking to this kind of socialist model as an alternative to, Western style capitalism as a potential kind of way to kickstart their newly, or to develop these kind of new young countries. And so you see these with certain of these kind of African socialist countries like Tanzania, like Zambia, Egypt to some extent, you see these kind of special relationships start to form. And so one of the things that you and I, for example, found in a paper that we published a couple of years ago in International Studies Quarterly is that these, in certain African countries, these kind of long-standing relationships and the kind of connections and knowledge that certain Chinese actors, for example, the state-owned enterprises have in those places, still, have an impact, for example, in terms of facilitating foreign direct investment today. In terms of a broader kind of special bond between China and the African continent, I do think that there's something in this idea that, for example, the Chinese foreign minister will always make the first, trip every year to an African state. And if you kind of contrast that diplomatic attention paid to Africa with, say, for example, the UK where I'm from, or the United States, which tend to kind of play lip service, but not really actually go for the the ceremony. I think that's where you see this idea of perhaps there's this kind of, special connection. But I don't want to make out that that's some kind of, perfect special bond. We can get into, many different consequences. Consequences of that. But I do think there is something in these kind of historical ties that were forged during the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
All right, so you think still we can say there is something special in the bonds or the plays that Africa or some African countries have in the kind of Chinese framing of the world?
Okay, so I think
it's
okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know who you're going to ask the question. Well, but I think it was Pippa was right. I think this is something which has to go back to the the 50s and the 60s. I think even I think China has, as I said, there's an official rhetoric about this kind of China developing global South. This is actually can be all traced back to the 1955, the Bandung Conference, which I think it's, this is sort of like the first time all these third world countries, they have this kind of a big conference. They were actually create this idea of the South-South cooperation. So I think this is sort of like a South-South cooperation, which is, having this kind of a principle of this, mutual benefits and non-interference of the domestic issues, and also treat each other as a partners. So those kind of principles has always been China has been holding those kind of principles when it's dealing with the African countries. So this is something I think it's that has been consistently being the main principle of the China-African relations. So if we call, I think that was part of that, like the core, bonds between China and Africa. But then I think it's obvious that we can see then the later on this kind of developments, from this, the economic sides that actually make this relationship become multifaceted. I think there's a more variety of this relationship, not actually with just one African continent, but with just many African countries. So this kind of relationship actually become more, diverse. Yeah.
All right, and that diversity we will keep speaking about. Starting off a bit broadly, although I would like you to be a bit specific. We have talked a bit about those bonds, the relatively long history, and I've kind of hinted at that I at least see China doing quite a few things in African countries that they also kind of learn from and are influenced also by themselves in their own Chinese policymaking. What are some of the kind of lessons or learning points, successes or failures that you would like to point out as kind of good indications of what we are discussing over the years? Pippa, do you want to skip back? I'm sorry for my previous question. We're not sitting face to face, right? So I have the physical expression when I'm asking a question back. But some of that gets lost, not in translation, because I can understand very well what you're saying, but it's kind of hard to wink or point discreetly, right? Across the
Sure.
screens.
Sure, got it. Sorry, we're always wondering which one should go first. Okay, so I think that there are
switch
try
it
to
up
mix
a
it
bit,
up.
mix it up a bit, to make it a bit more exciting. I think we're all probably a bit, this web-based seminars is the best we can get across countries, but I'm sure all of us are a bit tired of talking into screens. So, try to make it a bit lively. But sorry, Pippa, go ahead. If you still remember my question, that is.
I think so, yes. So on kind of learning experiences. So I'd actually like to pull it back even further a little bit in terms of kind of tracing the model of development cooperation between so if we're thinking about, for example, Chinese infrastructure finance. So this was actually the model, for example, if we take the Angola model of infrastructure in exchange for natural resources, this is actually something that Japan used with China to facilitate Chinese development quite, effectively, actually, during China's kind of the initial years after China's reform and opening. And then you see China kind of take this model that worked domestically within China and apply it to Africa. And so China's been, doing that, applying these kind of infrastructure in exchange for natural resources, or more generally loans for infrastructure in Africa for a very long time. And I think you can now see this kind of spreading out with the Belt and Road, for example. Now China's, Chinese companies, Chinese loans are increasingly supporting infrastructure in, across Eurasia. So you can kind of see this coming out of the African case and spreading more widely. You can also see, just because Africa's been kind of a locus of China's aid program for a long time, certain blueprints, for example, if we take the medical teams, right? So the very first medical team went to Algeria in 1963. And those kind of teams that we saw going out during the first wave of the COVID pandemic, they look pretty similar in terms of them being, these small teams of doctors and nurses armed with supplies, and their translators and chefs. They always have a chef, which I like. And so you do see these kind of models, going from Africa to the rest of the developing world. And then now if we look at Latin America, for example, we can see very similar things happening. At the same time, some of the concerns that initially arise in Africa also are now arising elsewhere. So for example, you see Southeast Asian countries start to become concerned about Chinese debt and potential ability or inability to repay that debt. Those concerns were ones that were first raised within the African context.
All right, good.
I think that there, in terms of lessons, or well, there are many of them. I think this probably has to do with China's way to dealing with those development issues, not only with foreign countries but also domestically. This is sort of like a Chinese term. We have been learning by doing, right? Sort of like they don't really have a kind of like a well-designed plan initially. They were just started to try something first, having this kind of experiments. For example, I think this is sort of like very typical type of the Chinese way of this development. They set up some experiment zones. They try that. If they worked, they're gonna actually continue to roll over, expand it. And then if they didn't, they're gonna actually take it back. So this is sort of like the same type of experience what China was doing with Africa. So they kind of like start by setting some of this, the kind of like experiment parks, right? So like industrial parks or the special economic zones. Then they're gonna try to see if they worked or not. So because I think this kind of a model, they would have been very flexible. So they would also be ready to accept any type of like a failure or unsuccessful, a failure or this kind of those kind of results. So, but I think this is kind of the way they actually, because all this, the environment is changing over time, both I think in terms of like their understanding about this, like the African countries actually getting better, so they would actually start to improve this kind of plan. So I think this is sort of like I would call that this is something always there's a lessons China has learned from this kind of like this type of like practice. But if there's any particular lesson, I think I think this China would actually because of this official narrative that African is just a one continent. I think as many people actually, when they actually went out to Africa to invest, so they just think that Africa was just the one country, which I think it's one big continent, which is quite similar. But it turns out like it's a continent with 54 countries, which are very diverse in terms of their culture, in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of like their economic development. So I think those kind of things, which actually has also make people to rethink about their plan to try to have a big big plan for the whole African continent. So they have to kind of like make it more specific to tailor to each country's specific conditions. So I think that was one, if we call that's a lessons we could be learned from this China's dealing with this Africa's on this economic relationship. Yeah.
Right, and that's obviously also very much in line with a lot of the policy making that China itself has been making domestically in its own economic and social development. Is there any kind of like things that didn't work, like obvious failures that were stopped and not kind of discontinued that you want to point to?
Well, if you look at some of this, the initial plans on this industrial parks, those kind of plans were actually being implemented even before this, Belt and Road Initiative. So that means, China has, remember, I think it's getting, because here's a background. I think China started to, invest in Africa as early as, the beginning of the 21st century. Well, I think there are some investment before, but I think most of them actually came after the sort of like the go out policy, which was initiated in 2000s. So since then, I think there's a lot of like investments and projects or infrastructure projects being built, and also loans has been made, and also investments has been made. So I think there are some of those kind of like those kind of so-called industrial parks, or has been planned and implemented in some of the African countries, but later on they have been kind of like found that they are still on paper. So there's nothing has been done. So these actually turn out to be totally the waste of the money. That it didn't work out. So actually, I think I was, as I mentioned, I was gonna having a talk actually right after this, which I think I'm going to host, another African specialist, Professor Tang Xiaoyang, who's actually has an excellent study on this Chinese, special economic zones in Africa, which I think is in his book. He has mentioned, studied all those kind of, success and the failure of those Chinese, special economic zones or industrial parks in Africa. I think I can refer to his book if you wanted to know more detail about that.
I want I want you to take notes and then send them over this afternoon, and then we'll have a continue the discussion privately. No, he's also an excellent scholar at Tsinghua, right? Out with a new book. Pippa, are you like all the optimist and looking at the successes, or also paying attention to some of the less successful, or what you might be called failing instruments and policies?
So I'd like to highlight one thing, which I'm not sure this is a learning point per se, but a kind of challenge for China's economic relations with Africa, which is if you look at, for example, the public opinion data on what African citizens think about China. So for example, the Afrobarometer data, these kind of big development projects, the large scale infrastructure and so on are pretty positively viewed. But what African citizens are concerned about, according to the data, is one, the quality of Chinese products. So for example, concerns about markets being flooded with these kind of low quality or cheap manufacturers. And two, and I think these two things are connected with each other, the kind of crowding out of local manufacturing capabilities by essentially Chinese imports being, very cheap. Chinese factories are very good at making lots of things very cheaply, and so this kind of crowds out the local industry. And I think it's going to be a challenge, or a challenge for the China-Africa relationship over the coming years, is how to kind of rebalance that, and how can China get involved in building local manufacturing capabilities. And we can see this, right, attempts to do this, for example, through the industrial parks, which are, as you mentioned, sometimes successful and sometimes unsuccessful. But I think it's certainly, it's been one of the much less positive impacts of the China-Africa economic relationship is the potential impact on local manufacturing capabilities. So the question now is, can China play a role in actually building that either back up or building it up from scratch?
All right. I think if I'll add something to that, which is a bit what I think Pippa already talked a bit about, is the kind of diplomatic efforts and all the diplomatic work that I think China has been very active at in many African countries, and have been quite successful, I think, at creating a regional dynamic around the Africa Cooperation Forum, around the work and kind of warming up relations to the African Union. And I think also the African Development Bank was the first kind of out of Asia development bank that China joined. So there's on the organizational kind of international multilateral organizational front, I think also China has been getting quite a lot of traction or dynamic around quite a few issues with quite a few countries, obviously with hiccups and problems. And some of those efforts, I would say China has also been tried to kind of copy or try to push elsewhere with relatively little success when it comes to that regional dynamic. I think it's also in terms of rescue missions and crisis, to deal with crisis, when it comes to health, other issues also where as you guys have mentioned, where China has really worked quite actively in Africa and then tried to do some of the same things in other countries. One thing I wanted to, which is kind of continuing our conversation around this, if I normally talk about what I call kind of China development contribution or China's development supply role. And in that perspective, I include what people normally talk about as aid, which is like rent-free grants, aid packages, loans that are so low rated or so concessional that they count as aid, and also debt relief, which is kind of easy to count as a strict aid package, also on the OECD standards. And then in between there is development kind of contributions that might be loans that are quite beneficial, credits that might be very useful, other types of infrastructure deals that are given on not necessarily aid terms, but kind of beneficial terms. And then in the last category, it's the more commercial activities, which I myself actually think it's probably the most important when it comes to trade and when it comes to commercially based or market-based loans and credits and packages. My question is, however, in my take, we've seen kind of an explosion of the alongside China's economic growth and the commercial and kind of aid assistance type of packages, but quite kind of slow and gradual and maybe incremental changes when it comes to those aspects that we normally, at least in Europe, think of as aid. Is that something like a perspective that you share, that kind of the aid component of China's development contributions are much more conservative or kind of slower to change than kind of this whole package of economic ties?
Well, China has been giving aids to many developing countries, particularly in Africa. For it has a long history of being a provider of the aids, but China doesn't call it as a donor, right? I think it's as we using normally refers to this kind of like OECD DAC countries, and also because of that, China also have its own sort of like a definition about the aid. It doesn't really having those kind of like very technically to only includes grants or concessional loans, all those kind of things. China was actually have a package. They were just which is handled by the used to handled by the governed by the Ministry of Commerce. But they're having this kind of like administration which is in charge of the aid implementation to Africa. So this is so traditionally, I think the Chinese are actually giving a lot of aids to Africa, but gradually you see this kind of like the China has been as China actually expand its relationship with Africa, so their financial flows actually to Africa has become much larger, but the components of the aid actually, the proportion of aid actually becomes smaller and smaller. If you look at the you mentioned about this China-African, Cooperation Forum, which I think which occurred every 3 years since 2000. So in the last two FOCAC, this China-African Development Forums, China has pledged to give, I think it's $60 billion of this, the finance to Africa, but they actually make it very specific. I think that there is only a small portion of them was actually categorized as aid. I believe it's only about like a 5 billion something. I think it's so it's a very small portion of that. But I think it's that being said, I think it's China would actually, this is a sort of like they think it's not about like what's the whether it will be considered as an aid matters. It's more about the whole package of development finance, as long as it's actually going to help the Africa to develop the economy. I think it doesn't matter whether it's called aid or it's called a development finance. So I think this is sort of like the distinction between the sort of like the Chinese way and also the Western way about the aid. And then secondly, I think if you look at, we want to just make a distinction about this sort of like one of the main feature of China's, development finance is actually they tend to combine those, all three things together, which is the aid, which is loan and investments. So sometimes also those export credits, if we actually put them all together as a whole package. So those package, was actually given to this, the African countries as a way to help them to, they could actually use to for this manufacturing or for other production sectors. So I think that's just the one main characteristic of the Chinese, development cooperation. That is, a close integration of this all different type of the financial sources. Yeah.
All right. Very good and scholarly presentation. Pippa, do you have like a take on what like the more kind of rapidly changing and the less kind of rapidly changing dimensions of China's development role or contributions?
Sure. So I fully agree with what's been said already by both of you in terms of basically everything else kind of exploding, whereas aid, just kind of gradually perhaps increasing, a little bit, but then its proportional share decreasing as a result. And what you said about, packaging these things together. And I think that this kind of package model is also a way to kind of scale up limited resources, right? So I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that China is still a middle income country. Its domestic economic development level is broadly on par with a lot of South American countries. China doesn't have unlimited ability to give grants and very, very low interest loans to countries on the other side of the world. Basically, China wants to get something back from something back economically from the relationship. And so by packaging this aid plus, so grants or very low interest loans, plus say, for example, a non-concessional loan, plus foreign direct investment, you put all of these things together, you can have a kind of, it's a way to do things at scale that might not be possible if China was just offering, these things that looked like the OECD DAC definition of aid.
Good. I think continuing on that kind of the same type of question, I think that one of the projects that have brought you and me together, and hopefully we will also keep engaging with Pippa, comes from kind of this idea that we want to understand what's happening with the aid component of China's development role better, simply because it is increasing, not necessarily becoming more important in terms of Chinese politics, but it's becoming more and more visible internationally. Is there any kind of, I'm keep pondering myself over what might be the incentives for China to kind of keep the way it has done things the last few decades, or the incentives to kind of to change a bit. And we saw the creation, of course, of the establishment of this International Development Agency, the SIDCA, as kind of at least an indication that some things might be changing. If you look at the last 5-year plan, which I've read quite carefully, and I will go back and look at more of the policy documents in the ongoing research, there are some specific wording there about not specific what's going to happen, but changes that should occur also when it comes to the debt, the aid component of China's contributions. Are there incentives? What are the incentives that you would point to if we talk about potential changes? Why should China change, if it should?
Me? Okay.
Yeah,
I'll go. Sure.
I can see you like bouncing a bit back and forth, and that's fine. It's you. Yeah.
Okay, so I think in terms of the creation of the SIDCA, a very big incentive was basically to kind of try to resolve a long-standing challenge in coordination and different motivations between the Ministry of Commerce, which had, or its, previous iterations, which had long been in charge of, technically the leading ministry in China's foreign aid program, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So these two, which also, played a very important role. So these two bodies, basically, these two institutions had, different ideas about what they wanted China's aid program to actually be used for. And, naturally, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is interested in politics, right? It's interested in diplomacy, whereas the Ministry of Commerce is much more interested in economics. And there'd long been a kind of tussle between the two. And so the creation of the SIDCA, and you see with kind of the personnel that were brought to staff the SIDCA was kind of an attempt to resolve that ongoing tension by bringing China's foreign aid strategy into this new organization. In terms of other kind of incentives or pressures to change its practices, I mean, if we're thinking about the kind of conventional Western aid norms of the OECD DAC, China's faced this kind of pressure to change in two main areas. One is on transparency and release of data. Another is on the tying of aid to the use of a Chinese contractor. And I mean, frankly, on the transparency front, we haven't really seen much, right, in terms of change in the release of data. We haven't seen the kind of the data that researchers like us would love to get our hands on.
Keep us alive.
Also, yes, exactly. It would be wonderful. In terms of tying this practice of tying Chinese aid to the use of a Chinese contractor, again, I haven't seen any changes in this area. Although I have to admit, I haven't looked very closely at this recently. But I think there is a kind of, if I was to predict, that could be an area that would be quite easy for China to change, actually, in my opinion, because if you look, for example, at World Bank projects on, and which contractors actually win those World Bank projects, which are open tender. Chinese contractors win many of them. So if China was to stop tying its aid program to the use of a Chinese contractor, I very much think you're still going to see many Chinese companies still winning those projects by virtue of their speed and experience and cheapness, frankly. So I think that could be an area that to my mind anyway seems to be a potential area for evolution.
All right. Yu is still there, or did he fall off? Yeah, I think that the screen for Yu is black, so we'll have to see if he comes back into the vision, or it will be just me and you, Pippa. It's one of the things that I have at least thought about in terms of changes is alongside China's growth all over the world and all its engagements, also when it comes to development issues, obviously also the problems and challenges and the kind of failing projects will become more and more visible just by the extension of the volume increasing. And that's an area where I've at least in my conversations with Chinese officials, have got the indications that they might join and catch on to some of the more international dynamics, simply also not to have to deal with all the never-ending problems that will keep coming up. You mentioned, I think you mentioned, there is his back. Is it? Are we still? We're still online with you, right?
Yes.
We were talking about incentives. Is there anything you would like to add in terms of if there's any kind of obvious reasons or pressures why China should change some of its ways, or if that's just kind of international bickering?
Well, I think is if you look at this from the well, I think it's what Pippa said. It was just, the setup, this kind of a SICA was trying to resolve this kind of like a, coordination problems between those different department agencies. That's exactly that was true, absolutely true. But I think it's also to look at beyond that is actually the SICA was actually a kind of like a vice ministerial level of the agency, which is higher than the previous his predecessor. That means I think is this foreign aid issue has been putting up in a much as a priority, agenda lists, than it was before. I think this is sort of like China actually really think this foreign aid is actually important components of the foreign policy. So if you look at the latest, white paper, which was published, in January, it's called the China and International Development Cooperation. So they actually have CERN has actually put something new, which is compared to the previous two white papers. That is, I think, is for the first time. I think they actually put this, Belt and Road Initiative into this kind of, as talking about that in this their agenda, which I think that's which means they do have a larger or grand, plan for how this aid would actually serve this China's, so like, the as a part of the foreign policy. Policy tool instruments. And secondly, you see that China has also been engaging more with this multilateral development, organizations, with the United Nations, with World Bank, and also it set up this sort of like a new initiated this new, Asian Infrastructure Development Bank and a new development banks with BRICS. So all those kind of like new initiatives also indicates China has actually looked beyond this just as a bilateral aid, which I think it was this traditional way to dealing with, the developing countries. Now China is moving more towards this kind of like at the multilateral fronts. But I think it's on that part, you see China has been using sort of like, kind of like earmarked funds go through this, multilateral, organizations. That means they would give this funds to this multilateral organizations for their distribution, but they will have to be specified where you can put that. So that is actually become a trend that the China engaging with this, those kind of like international organizations. But that was not only happen in China. It's actually become a global trend. I think there's many countries that are starting to using this kind of like the so-called as a multi-by kind of like development finance, which they using this sort of like a earmarked funds, but go through this multilateral organizations. So if you see all this happening, right, both actually in terms of like a scale of the China's development finance and also the way China is dealing with both this, at a bilateral level and also multilateral level, it's actually give this kind of like a pressure for China to really kind of like puts this the aids as a higher level in and also they actually become more important for to as a part of the China's foreign policy instruments. Yeah.
All right, very good. It's I think I'll continue a bit on a question that we have already talked a little bit about. And to frame it, we of course know that with China's foreign policy and its 8 kind of principles that stress win-win, sovereignty, non-interference, there's also this concept that like local ownership and local agency, and that to pay attention to what countries and kind of development partners actually want. Kind of from your views, where do we actually see the African countries' agencies come into play concerning what China is contributing to or being part of in various African countries? Pippa, I want to go first.
Sure.
We're not moving forward this time, so it's not.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it speaks to a broader kind of point that I'd like to make, actually, which is that because China has this very kind of demand-driven approach to development finance, where countries kind of propose projects that they want, and China basically decides whether to agree or not agree with them. African countries do have a lot of agency in shaping the nature and the consequences of the development finance that they get from China, and that means that it can be used either for very successful and useful things, or it can be used for things that are not particularly useful. To give an example from my own research, so one of the countries that I've done research in is Malawi, which after building diplomatic relations with China in late 2007, early 2008, basically got this kind of moment where they can ask for lots of things from China. And the things that they asked for were not very useful things. Like, for example, a very big, beautiful parliament building, and some nice presidential villas and a 5-star conference center. And these things are look very nice and kind of change the skyline of the capital, but they're not going to incentivize companies to invest there. For example, there's not electricity infrastructure, for example, would be much more helpful. Whereas if you take, for example, another case, which I know that you has done a lot of research in, and I've also done some research in, is Ethiopia, where you see this kind of drive to use Chinese funding to deliver things that are going to be useful for the country's economic development. That's not to say that it's always successful, right? Like, things go wrong sometimes. But you do see the Ethiopian government, or you have seen the Ethiopian government trying to kind of strategically use Chinese finance in a way that has, in certain contexts, in certain cases, delivered investment into the country, and as a result, deliver jobs and development. So because of China's kind of demand-driven, hands-off approach, there is a lot of scope for recipient countries or for partner countries to kind of shape what they get from China. Having said that, I think that there's scope for individual states, but there is this kind of power imbalance between, naturally, by virtue of China's size, right? China's huge. So there's always an imbalance between China and its African partners. I do think some level of more regional or continental wide coordination in the relationship with China would help, try to exercise that agency on a kind of higher level than the individual state level could be potentially helpful.
All right. Something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that was pretty accurate, in terms of like all those kind of the projects, not necessarily the aid project, but also this kind of like construction projects or investment projects was initiated by locals, which I think it's oftentimes was kind of like asked by this, the local officials or governments, but they also actually been there's engagement of some Chinese business people in African countries that some of them were actually the constructor of this kind of the project. So that was kind of like if you're saying when those kind of project was being conducted, was kind of like the first they had actually sent this kind of like initiate this kind of proposal, then goes to this Chinese side. Then they would actually decide whether they would wanted to you know, issue this. If it's a kind of like if it's gonna be a project, they're gonna go through this, you know, the Sitka, or previously go to the Ministry of Commerce to approve. Or if this actually more like a investment project, or you know, it's a loan, more commercial loan project, this actually going to goes to, you know, the two policy banks, or you know, the export and import banks, or this China development banks, for review whether they would actually grant this kind of loans to actually to finance this project. So I think that was kind of actually at the very you know, specific level, that you do see that lots of actors were actually involved in this kind of like a project, starting from this initiation to the implementation. So, but at the macro level, I think there's also, you see, I think China has been quite, you know, careful, and also to uphold this kind of like non-interference principle, that they were not trying to get involved in any of this domestic politics in any of those countries. So, but oftentimes they would actually facing this kind of dilemma, right? Because they have a big investment there, but they also have to dealing with, you know, which has been become a lots of uncertainty when there's a sort of like a political back and forth. But you know, when those things happens, I think there's a little they can do, because I think given that they're still having this kind of like a non-interference of the principle, they have to pretty much stick to that. So I think that was something which I think is all those kinds of Chinese business faced when they actually dealing with not only African countries, but with many of those countries, because I think it's you have this economic interest or commercial interest on the one hand, but you have this kind of like you know, foreign policy, diplomatic, you know, this the principles for this foreign policy on the other hand, they are always difficult to balance on you know, on two fronts. Yeah.
All right, I'm happy that you speak so much about development banks. I'm updating a paper I'm writing myself about all China's engagement in all the major development banks. I will definitely push that forward for you to comment. Sure. On the non-interference thing. I'm not going to delve into that. That's obviously like a huge topic internationally. Myself, I often argue that when China is nowadays so involved in some countries, at least at such a level, it's also hard to argue that you don't interfere by not interfering in a way. If you insist to not interfere, you're obviously also influencing what's happening on the ground. But that's for Chinese policymakers to keep juggling. I wanted to ask a bit, you've both been involved in studies and published papers on perceptions, attitudes, right? That you already talked a bit about towards China's involvement in both the aid-related and kind of investment or imagine trade, like economic ties related. Is there something very general to say? I mean, we already talked about Africa not, you know, being one. It's lots of countries, lots of local situations. But is there something very general to say, or is it kind of very different opinions and perceptions that you see across the African continent when it comes to China's involvement?
I think,
yeah.
Sure, I'll go. I fully agree that it's very difficult to make generalizations across the continent. And if you look at the Afrobarometer data, which is a kind of gold standard on you know, public opinion data, you do see like quite differing opinions across different countries in terms of you know, their perceptions of China and whether that's positive or negative. I guess if I was to make some generalizations, it would be the same generalization that I alluded to earlier in our discussion, which is that broadly speaking, views on these big infrastructure and large-scale investments are actually, pretty positive. And they're generally speaking welcome for their impact on economic development. However, maybe those kind of actually smaller scale actors. So for example, small businesses that may not necessarily, maybe operating under the radar, may not necessarily be following the rules, and also the perceptions of the quality of certain Chinese products are kind of things that are damaging the broader perception of China and Africa. But I would add the caveat to that it's pretty hard to make generalizations.
Right. Well, if you actually look at this kind of the two recent Afro barometer survey, which I think is we all refer to that as because that was the only multinational kind of survey, right, has been available. If we look at the latest one was, I think, was conducted in 2019 or 2020. I think it's before. I think it's before the COVID hits the world, and then the previous one was actually done in 2015 and 16. And I think there one specific question they ask about, what is the favorite development models? The African ask about this African respond, publics. I think you look at this kind of like, because the same question has been asked, 5 years apart, right? In the previous one, I think in both surveys, I think China was ranked as a #2 models, after the United States. I think it's the second one was kind of like, you see this China's, the score was slightly higher than the previous ones, but there is not actually very significant. So that means, I think, is African was still kind of like, they look favorably in general towards the China, and mostly about their economic developments and also their impact on this African economy. But they still, I think, consider as the United States as the most favorable, so like the #1 models, that in both of the surveys. I don't know whether this kind of like, if they actually do another one, after the COVID, so whether they're going to significantly change their sort of like attitudes. I don't know, but I think this is something we, at least for this kind of like last few years before the COVID, you see this kind of things where China, the perception about China has been quite, consistent, and also they're towards this positive side. So of course there are some variation across countries, but just in general, I think the perception about China is overall it's kind of positive, yeah. But of course there are some perception, which has Pippa already mentioned, that also could actually hurt this the perception about China, their the quality of the products, or etc. Yeah.
Great. I have more questions prepared. I'm just going to ask if is there any questions that popped up? No, not so far. So if anyone listening have questions, just write them into the chat function and we'll consider them. You have to go soon, but I'll try to pitch. You just leave whenever you have to, right? But I'll try to pitch in at least a few more questions before Pippa and me finish off. We've talked about kind of the long history of Chinese aid or kind of special development government type of relations relating back to the 50s and 60s. We talked about increasing economic ties, the explosion of investment and trade and business related engagements. So I guess we're talking about like a very and increasingly diverse picture and puzzle, right, of lots of Chinese and other actors representing all types of different interests and institutions, and probably after a while a fraction of those actually kind of pointing back to a government relation. in kind of your view, that's a big question, but what's the role of politics in all of this when the kind of actors are diversifying and the government aspect of this might be getting smaller compared to what was the case, just a couple of decades back? Pippa?
Sure. So I think while I take the point that the role of the government is getting smaller, I think that's an absolute rather than a relative. Sorry, that's a relative rather than an absolute trend. So I think that those government-to-government relations remain equally important. It's just that we now have lots of other types of relationships which are also very, very important. And so that reflects essentially China. It reflects a very simple phenomenon, frankly, which is the huge growth of the Chinese economy and the internationalization of Chinese businesses. That basically means that there are many different, and varied actors engaging with Africa. Personally speaking, I don't think that means politics has gone away. I just think that it's, relatively declined as everything else has exploded, but it's still very much there and still very important. I will say though that there is while politics is very important and, these kind of top level diplomatic and official relations are very important, that doesn't mean that at the political level, they can always, kind of make the economic actors do what they want. So in economics, we can think of it as like a principal agent problem. So, for example, a Chinese company may be much more concerned about its profit, whereas the government may be more concerned about the kind of long-term relationship, and where those two things diverge, problems may occur. But I definitely don't think politics has gone away. It's still very important.
Yeah. Well, can I think I saw there's the questionnaires raised on the message board. So maybe I should just, try to address the question. And I have to go, because I have to catch up with the next, event, and I have to apologize that I have to leave earlier. So I think the question.
Can I just interrupt a bit? If you can respond to that, that would be great. But could you also just pay 10 seconds? I want to zoom back to our kind of research idea. So if I was to give you, let's say 10 million US dollars, that's around like 80 million Norwegian krones, around 65 million Chinese krones. You had to spend it on research related to China and Africa. What would you do? Answer those two questions, and then you can run off to the book talk.
That's a tough one, right? I think that I've been, well, if I know the correct answer, I shouldn't be stay here. I think I'll be investment banker. well, that's a joke, right? I think this is the one thing, if you look at, China's recent engagements or overseas investments, the more than half of those kind of investment goes to one sector, that is renewable energy. I think it's this is one of the things which we haven't talked about this, but this has really actually become a big issue, in recent time, as China has, a pledge to commit to meet this kind of like the target for the carbon neutrality by 2060, and also to reach to the peak of this carbon emission by 2030. This actually become a huge big issue domestically, and also I think that's also affected China's actually investments in overseas. And I think it's also because most of the Chinese investments actually in developing countries, even for this energy project, they have been not actually going to go to this, so like those traditional energy projects or those fossil energy projects. It's actually can all go to the renewable energy. So I think this probably was the one big areas, which I think they see this potential for China and African to cooperate in the future. That I think Africa was not actually only offer any those natural resources, it could also be a place which they can actually having lots of potential for this renewable energy, project sectors to grow. So this is sort of like my answer to that question. I think I probably have to go. But I saw there's a questions on the the message boards. I think I will leave that for Pippa. So I have to apologize for that. But this has been fun, great. I think I really very much look forward to next time we can actually having this kind of like a conversation or or presentation. So thank you, and I have to go. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ian. Enjoy your book talk, and looking forward to catch up again very soon. I'll pitch a question back to you, Pippa, since I already asked you. You kind of took it more as an investment opportunity. If I asked you, Pippa, I gave you $10 million, but for research. You had to choose like a topic in a way of doing research, spend those money wisely. How would you set it up?
That's a wonderful question. So I have several things on my list here.
Top two.
Top two. Okay. So first one. So I actually just finished a paper on something that I've become interested in recently, which is the kind of provincial or subnational Chinese dynamics in terms of the relationship with Africa. And so what this paper did was look quantitatively at which firms from which Chinese provinces are kind of motivated to go out to invest in Africa. And what I found is that it's not those kind of provinces it's not those firms from, the big globalized, very successful ones like Jiangsu or Guangdong or Shanghai. And it's not those kind of isolated inland provinces like Ningxia, for example, or Guizhou. It's those kind of, middle of the road, your Anhui, Shandong type provinces, which basically don't have the same kind of opportunities or access to capital at home as the firms in the very successful provinces do, but at the same time still have the kind of knowledge and experience to actually go abroad. They tend to go to places like to Africa. And so what I'd really like to do, if you're going to give me a bunch of money to do it, is to get into the qualitative dimensions of that. So really spend some time with firms from different Chinese provinces and understand their motivations and their experiences and their kind of pathways in terms of their investments in Africa. So really just better, and broadly speaking, just better understand these kind of subnational dynamics, because China is such a big, diverse place that treating China as this kind of unitary, actor is just, I think there's a lot of room for exploration in terms of how differences within China shape the China-Africa relationship. So that's one thing that I'd like to spend the money on, if it were to exist. Another is a more kind of policy-focused one, and perhaps this is down to my own kind of biases and like wishful thinking. As China's relations with many Western countries become increasingly strained in recent years. One area where there is a lot of room and has been happening for cooperation between China and the West, and where there are kind of mutual benefits and comparative advantages, is this idea of trilateral cooperation. So what that means is China, a traditional development partner, and an African state or states kind of coming together to design and implement a project. So, for example, with the UK, we had the Partnership for Growth and Investment in Africa, which is basically a partnership across China, the UK, and several 4 pilot states to try to bring companies from China and the UK to invest. And I think that it's you know, it has a lot of potential policy relevance, and you know, it personally, and again, I don't know if this is just my kind of desire to, as a British person who happens to live and work in China and be very invested in all of these relationships, but it's something that it's not something that I've done, you know, formal academic research on, but it's something that I would like to do in the future.
Interesting. I think we need to look for opportunities to do some of that. I think if I was to just get a big grant and spend it, I'm not sure which specific topic or place I would go to, but I would definitely set it up in a way that enables us to collect data very systematically, both quantitatively and qualitatively, I think, and most importantly, be able to trace it over time. I think it's so valuable with the research, which is like really costly and demanding, where researchers are able to kind of keep returning to the individuals they talk to, but also to the kind of the fields and the issues they deal with. So you kind of get developments over time and not this kind of snapshot perspectives that, of course, some of our field work is forced to do because we only have that one opportunity to go and talk to people. So that would be excellent, whether it's looking at different firms in Chinese provinces in different Chinese countries or some other issues, and following really what happens over time and try to really explain why those changes take place. We have a couple of questions that both kind of relate to something we have touched upon on these regional dimensions. So the one question was about whether the role of the African Union might be increasing or decreasing alongside kind of bilateral ties and possibly other international or multilateral engagements. So that's the role of the African Union. And then the other question is going in the same direction, I think, in asking whether FOCAC, or the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation, might play a stronger role in terms of diplomatic ties between countries. And I guess also that the questioner is asking for whether it might be used in some ways to mediate or kind of discuss issues that might strengthen the overall ties. Do you have any kind of take on those, Pippa?
Sure. So yeah, these are two very good and interrelated questions that both kind of speak to this potential for coordination, more coordination at the multilateral level in the China-Africa relationship. So on FOCAC, first of all, I mean, I definitely think FOCAC is a very useful forum. And it's actually, my understanding is that it was originally something that was not demanded, but requested by certain African countries that wanted to have this more kind of systematic and more formalized framework for their engagement with China. And certainly given the amount of attention that is put on a FOCAC summit every time, or FOCAC meeting every time one occurs, you can infer from that all sides do seem to find it a useful forum. And there's always a lot of attention on what are the FOCAC numbers at each summit. So however, as I mentioned, and this speaks to the question about the African Union, actually, I mentioned previously that I thought one potential way that African countries might better kind of shape their engagement with China is in exercising agency more at a multilateral or regional level, rather than, still most things are happening on this kind of bilateral basis. And given, as I mentioned previously, the kind of natural power and bargaining power imbalance that there is given China's size, I think I would love to see the African Union playing an even more kind of active role in coordinating a regional or continental approach to engagement with China.
Do you think, what's your take on, to the extent that you have data or a perspective on that, if you, which you're talking about, like the drive from African countries, not necessarily all African countries, because I'm sure there's very diverse interests there too. And contrasting to the kind of Chinese views, is there obvious kind of route for FOCAC and AU to kind of evolve further, or are we like immediately touching upon issues that are just getting very complicated because there are different countries involved that might want to push and do not want to push, and obviously also the types of issues that China, I think, would want to continue to treat bilaterally and not in a kind of a joint forum?
That's a very good question. Honestly, I don't have any concrete data to answer that question with. So I'll give a very general answer, which is that international cooperation, by its very definition, is always messy and complex and involves a coming together of sovereign states. Humanity is organized into a world of sovereign states in which, although interconnected, they are sovereign states. And so that means any kind of international cooperation is always going to have different interests, is always going to have different complexities that need to be managed. But it happens. So countries do come together to work together on issues of global concern. Sometimes they fail to do that. Sometimes they succeed in doing that. So I don't think in general that the existence of diverging interests is this kind of insurmountable barrier to a more kind of more multilateral, or more kind of regional approach to engagement with China. That's not to say that it would be beautiful and perfect and very easy, but I do think it could happen. Oh, I see there's another question actually.
Yeah, we don't know how long it's going to take to write. While that is being typed out, we have to round up very quickly. Is there something, we obviously still live in a world deeply affected by a pandemic, and some countries more affected than others. Do we see some kind of changes or developments to the China-Africa development related relations happening like in the last year that we might expect to kind of be a consistent feature moving forward? Is there anything that you've seen, or at least want to kind of look into questioning whether we are seeing some changes that might be driven, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but also with the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question to finish on. So I think there are some continuities and some opportunities for adjustment if we're thinking about the influence of COVID on the China-Africa relationship. So in terms of continuities, I think that you see China responding to the economic and the health crisis that was induced by COVID on the continent, using these kind of tried and tested methods. So for example, I mentioned previously in our discussion, the medical teams. These medical teams look very similar to the medical teams that China has been dispatching for decades and decades, down to the point where many of them were actually have been dispatched from the same province for decades. And another area of continuity is debts. So COVID didn't cause debt, distress, but it exacerbated existing or made worse existing problems. And China's responded to that using a kind of pretty standard playbook. So usually, except in the case of interest-free loans, which may be canceled, but in the case of most Chinese loans, China doesn't tend to respond positively to requests to cancel debt altogether, but they do absolutely respond to renegotiation requests and changes of terms and extensions and these kind of things. That's exactly what we've seen in relation to the COVID-19 debt. So there are continuities, but there are also opportunities for readjustment. So one of those is in the way that the COVID crisis has kind of highlighted the risks of relying on imports and relying on the risks of not having local manufacturing capacity. And so I think that potentially China could have an important role to play in building local, manufacturing capacity. So for example, recently we've seen Chinese company and Egypt sign a deal to produce Chinese vaccines in Egypt, which is much better for Egypt than importing vaccines from China, because you're getting the jobs, you're getting the knowledge spillovers, you're getting the local, capabilities being developed. So I think that's really positive. Another opportunity for readjustment is in an area we haven't touched on too much, which is ecologically. So China's been a very large source of demand for illegal wildlife trade, the illegal wildlife trade, much of which is sourced from African countries. And the Chinese government is really actually now following the pandemic, trying to do something about this. If you just walk around Shanghai, you will see, posters of don't eat wild animals, don't trade wild animals, something you never used to see before. And so there's a real drive to actually deal with this issue. And there's kind of anecdotal evidence that is having an impact. If you think of, for example, the collapse in the market for pangolins, anecdotal evidence, but it potentially could be an opportunity for readjustment in that area.
Readjustment and more research. I think we'll round up. There is one question hanging on that you might see in the chatter about the aspects of where China's aid could evolve. I don't think we allow time for elaboration, but do you see the question and you know what the person is asking about?
I do, yes. Yeah. So I raised two pressures that China faced to kind of adjust its aid policies. One was tying of aid to Chinese contractors. The other was transparency in terms of release of more detailed data. So right. I'm not going to elaborate. Data transparency.
You won't elaborate. But I think you gave, I'll encourage the person to kind of get back in touch if we still want to elaborate more on that. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I'm so much looking forward to talking again. I have a suspicion that our next encounter might also be digital or over the phone before we finally are able to meet either here in beautiful Bergen in Norway or obviously in Shanghai or elsewhere around the world. So thank you so much and looking forward to next time.